great pleasure to be here and to look at lovely buildings while speaking. I'll try not to do that too much. Can you hear me at the back, or should I use a mic? It's okay? Okay. And yeah, apologies for the old-fashioned style. So the handout is mainly, not quite only, but mainly quotations. So when I read out quotations, they should be on here, and I'll let you know where we are. And I guess, so I could have, in a sort of postmodern way, instead of talking about nothing, stood here and tried to successfully or otherwise do nothing, right? So I could have done one of these performance pieces where, and I think had I attempted this, you might think that in a sense I was doing nothing, but I'd also be doing various other things. Maybe I'd be, something I'll talk about later, I'd be doing nothing, which is a sort of performance you put on. Maybe I'd also just be infuriating, or I'd be testing you, or I'd be all sorts of, mainly I think terrible things, but there'd be all sorts of descriptions of what I was doing other than nothing. And so this kind of raises the question, is it ever possible to do nothing? And of course, you know, maybe if you're dead, you're doing nothing. Maybe you're decomposing, is that doing something? And so we might start want to make more focused conceptual questions about what is it to do anything. So you might think in order to know what it is to do nothing, you need to know what it is to do something. And before I tell you why I'm interested in this question and what I think about it, an immediate worry that pops up in people's heads, especially philosophers, is that, look, negatives, so what we might call negative actions, and I'll look into the debate whether there are such things as negative actions, but you might think negatives are just a problem anyway. All negatives are a problem. And you might think they're a kind of infuriating problem because we can do all these puns around say nothing, do nothing, talk about nothing, and so on. And you might think, okay, so you're playing with words, but so what? And so I want to begin with instances of the general issue. And I think, of course, the question about negative acts falls under this general issue. So if you have views about negatives more generally, what I say about action will, in some way, you will think about it through these ways. On the other hand, I want to say that there are questions that are important for action, and indeed for questions about ethics and responsibility, which is what I'm really interested in. But before I get to that, we're at the start of your handout, and the great defender of nothing is Heidegger, of course, so this is the first quotation on your handout. Why trouble ourselves about this no thing? Science, we'll be talking about science and philosophy later today, science rejects it, dismisses it as just nothing. However, by giving up the nothing in this way, do we not concede the nothing? As in, there's a thing we're giving up or a thing we're rejecting. Yet how can we talk of conceding when in fact we concede nothing? This is where you might think, now we're into the bad puns or something like that, right? Maybe all this back and forth is just wordplay. Science views the nothing as a ghost. Science wants to know nothing about the nothing. Okay, so there are these kind of questions where you might think, look, if I'm going to start talking about what it is to do nothing, are we entering this kind of land? Is the nothing or something, and so on. And so what I want to say is that it's hard to avoid some of this stuff, but that the questions I'm interested in aren't just these very general questions. Think of maybe a bit more straightforwardly amusing. Just look along the road and tell me if you can see either of them. This is from Alice Through the Looking Glass, so from Lewis Carroll. I see nobody. We have a nobody now on the road, said Alice. I only wish I had such eyes, the king remarked in a fretful tone, to be able to see nobody, and at the distance too. Right? So you might think, okay, so seeing nobody, what it really means is not to see someone. And then we have these puns about there's a nobody who I see. And so you might think, okay, doing nothing is just not to do something. And any question about there's a nothing which I did is just a pun like there's a nobody whom I saw. Right? And so part of what I want to ask is whether not doing anything is the same as doing nothing. And what is it to not do anything? And I guess to sort of show my cards in advance, my view is really that it's very hard, if not impossible, to ever know if you're not doing anything. And what this really means is that in not doing any particular thing, you're either always, or at least it's always possible, that you're doing something else. And this isn't to say that you're not doing the one thing is identical with you're doing the other thing. I will look at views like that. But it is the thought that we can never really know for certain if we're doing nothing. And I'm kind of suspicious of ideas about doing nothing. It's a different suspicion from that of David Lewis. This is the last quotation in the first section here. Absences are spooky things, and we'd best not take them seriously. But absences of absences are no problem. Okay. So the idea is going to be that there's something wrong about the thought that we can easily distinguish between positive and negative acts. And this is the language that is really introduced by Jeremy Bentham. So it's introduced in relation to early forms of utilitarianism. And this is no coincidence. So we have positive acts and negative acts. And in contemporary literature, nobody really thinks it's so crude, but when we're being quick, we really talk about act and omission. So even though philosophers are careful to distinguish omitting from refraining, from neglecting, from failing, and so on, so this is sometimes used as an umbrella term to cover a lot of things that aren't omissions. And I could give a different paper on all these little technicalities. But you might think, look, there's doing things and then there's not doing them, right? The positive and the negative. And the question is whether this is really an act at all. Are there such things as negative acts? Or is it just the absence of positive acts? And should we be suspicious of absences, right? So this is the kind of talk I'm interested in. But the reason I'm interested in it is because there's a debate between consequentialists and non-consequentialists about whether we're as responsible for acts as we are for omissions. So whatever your view on the ontology of positive and negative acts, there's this debate. And if you're consequentialist, then the only thing that matters are the consequences. Then whether you reach these consequences, say of somebody dying because you killed them or because you let them die when you could have saved them, doesn't matter, right? So we have this kind of debate. If all that matters is the consequences, then we're as responsible for omissions as for actions. And if we're responsible for them, then they must exist in some way. This is the kind of Heideggerian thing in a way, right? I'm probably the first and last philosopher to say Bentham is a kind of Heideggerian, but all I mean by it is that he's got to give some substance to the nothing if we're going to be responsible for doing nothing or for not doing anything. It's got to be something that we can be responsible for. And of course, you don't need to be a consequentialist to believe this, but you need to be a consequentialist to believe that we're as responsible, that there's no moral distinction between acts and omissions. So there's this debate, the people who think, no, it's much worse if you kill someone than if you let them die, the people who disagree, and I'm on neither side of this debate because I'm not sure we should have an act-omission distinction. And this is the point about the stuff where every omitting involves a kind of acting, and vice versa, every acting involves a kind of omitting. And I'm using omitting here in the loose sense that includes refraining, neglecting, failing, and so on. So if I'm trying to persuade you of anything today, it's that we shouldn't take these distinctions for granted as ontological distinctions. But if the distinction collapses, then it's not clear what we do with that initial question that consequentialists and non-consequentialists were debating. Okay. By the way, if anyone wants to interrupt at any point, I'm happy with that. Okay. So section 2 here, these aren't really quotations by philosophers. These are just things you will often see and read. Apologies for not being in touch sooner. Right? So there's a thing I'm apologizing for. And you might think it's a kind of failure. It's the failure to be in touch. Kotarbinsky, incidentally, has a typology of failure. Piotr has written about this. I'm not going to talk about this because I'm not convinced, this is not a point against him, but I'm not convinced that negative acts are failures. They can include failures, but positive acts can include failures too. Part of the collapse of the distinction will mean that failure can be everywhere, really. And so I'm not going to, I don't think a typology of failure will help us with an act-omission distinction. Okay. Please refrain from smoking. I'm looking at you in particular. Please do not feed the birds. I'm looking at you. So these are things that we can do, and then the request is not to do it. And you might be tempted to think, so is not doing it an action? And you might think, no, not doing it is just not acting, right? And we're falling into the bad puns if you're saying the thing you're doing is negative. Nonetheless, this is from, I can't remember what newspaper, The Independent probably, I don't know. Tory MP forgot to declare £400,000 income, but remembered to claim 49p for milk. Geoffrey Cox, this is the same person, neglected to declare, notice forgot and neglect here being used interchangeably, his bumper payday within 28 days, but in the meantime he put claims in for milk and tea bags. Now this is a kind of cheeky example because of course the person writing the headline doesn't really think the MP actually forgot, right? It's kind of convenient sort of forgetting. But nonetheless, there's a thought that there's something they didn't do and they're very culpable. And what's interesting at this point is that, so we're not in a consequentialist, anti-consequentialist debate, but it's not remotely tempting to think, well, forgetting is negative, it's not positive, therefore we're less responsible for it than doing something, right? That's just, whatever side you're on these kind of questions, that just doesn't appear when you're reading this. You don't think, but forgetting is an omission, so he's not as responsible for it as an action, right? And importantly, you might think, look, there are redescriptions here. You might think, what is it to neglect, to declare? I can redescribe this negative neglecting in positive terms. I can describe it as tax avoidance, actively. So it's not that I'm just forgetting or neglecting to do something, it's that I'm actively seeking to keep my money, or something like that, right? And so one debate we're going to have, a slightly annoying debate, is between people who think the only difference between positive and negative acts is a matter of description. So the idea is that there are these things called actions, and we can describe them in positive terms or negative terms. And ontologically, actions are kind of neutral, right? So it's the descriptions that are positive and negative rather than the acts. So that's one team. Another team thinks, no, it's the acts that are positive and negative. and a third team thinks there are no negative acts. Okay, this is a bit crude because there'll be people with slightly more nuanced views. And my view is closest to the one that says there are positive and negative descriptions of acts, but it's not quite that view because I think things are much harder than that. And the trouble, I think, with this view is that it commits us to a way of individuating acts that says my not doing the one thing is my doing the other, and vice versa. And while I think this can happen, I have nothing against this, I think often it's not, we can't quite individuate them this way. So it's more that in doing one thing, I'm not doing something else. But the question of whether my not doing something else just is my doing that thing is in many cases a very bad and peculiar question. And I'll try and give some examples. Okay. I start with the people who want to deny that negative acts exist at all. I think the best version of this denial is by Kent Bark. This is before we get to section 2 here, last quotation here. There is not much point in asking what it is not to do any of the countless things that you could conceivably be doing. One cannot merely not do something, but fail to do it. And what Bach is after, this is why failure for him is more important than it is for me in this context. And he has a point about this, that what Bach is saying is that right now, I'm not at the opera, right? There are all sorts of things we're not doing right now. And it can't be that in sitting here listening or taking notes or me speaking, it can't be that this act is identical with an infinite or at least indefinite number of acts. So Bach says it can't be the case that my speaking is my not going to and then name every single opera you can imagine that I might be at, and then every single football game. And so it can't be that these are things that are identical with my speaking, right? That would be ludicrous. And so he says the cases where we might have a claim for this must be ones where there's a kind of failure, right? So you may think, oh, what the failure is maybe tied to expectation in some way. So you might think, if I ought to be somewhere and I'm not, then we might start saying, look, here's a thing I'm not doing that I'm meant to be doing, something like that. Okay, so this is just to give you a taste for a kind of argument we might have. So in section 2, I've just put some names. So people who think negative acts exist: Bentham, Danto, Goldman, Brand, Vermazen, Davidson, and Michael Thompson. If these names mean nothing to you, it doesn't matter. It's just to give people some views. It's very, very, very rare for me to be against Ryle or von Rich, let alone both of them. So people who deny that there are negative actions include Gilbert Ryle, G.H. von Rich, David Lewis, and Kent Bach. So I'm fascinated by this because I tend to agree with these philosophers, especially the first two. But I really don't on this. Okay, now part of the problem, as with everything in philosophy, is what exactly is a negative act? Is it an omission? Is it a failure? Is it nothing? And so on. The term is Bentham's, as I mentioned, so if you look on the right-hand column here, acts may be distinguished. This is from Principles of Morals and Legislation. Acts may be distinguished in the first place into positive and negative. By positive acts are meant such as consist in motion or exertion. By negative, such as consist in keeping at rest. That is, in forbearing to move or exert oneself in such and such circumstances. Thus, to strike is a positive act. Not to strike on a certain occasion. So this is for Bach-style worries, actually. So it's not like every case of my non-striking is a negative act, but not to strike when provoked, for example, is a negative act. Positive acts are also styled acts of commission, negative acts of omission or forbearance. So he's happy to sort of qualify this a bit. And this is not a bad sort of initial attempt to define the terms. You might think, yes, look, there's the striking and then there's not striking, but because of the kind of opera examples, it's got to be not striking in a situation where striking would have in some way made sense, right? I don't think it needs to be a failure, because you may think not striking is a good thing. You shouldn't retaliate, right? So it's not that it's a failure to strike when you should have. I don't think that works. It might be the honorable thing, might be not to strike. But nonetheless, for it to be honorable, it's got to be in a context in which striking would have made sense. My not striking you right now isn't honorable, right? It's just something would go deeply wrong if anybody struck anyone for now. Okay, so this is the Bentham. Nonetheless, I don't really understand why things like keeping at rest aren't things we do. They don't look like nothing to me. And of course, part of this debate is what exactly is it to exert effort? What exactly is it to keep at rest? And so on. But if we leave the word action alone for a second, and we think of a phrase I much prefer, which is things we do. Keeping at rest seems like a thing we do, and so it doesn't look like a nothing. So doing now, is doing nothing the same thing as keeping at rest? I think that's just a bad question, because all languages have ambiguities of this kind. So doing nothing depends on what you contrast it with. So sometimes keeping at rest will be doing nothing. Sometimes even you might say, don't just stand there, do something. But of course, standing is doing something. And these are just bad questions. You might contrast thinking with action, and you can contrast speaking with acting. You might say, all this talk and no action, but that doesn't mean that there are no such things as speech acts, for example, or mental acts. So I just think what counts as acting or not acting depends on what we're contrasting it with. So we're not going to get any interesting typology by looking at the language here. Okay. In a neglected book called Human Acts, Father Darcy, this is the next quotation here, is having a small dig at Bentham. And while I don't agree with everything in this quotation, I think it brings up a nice range of examples, and to contrast it with Ryle's range of examples that we'll see in a moment. To the question, what were you doing at 2 o'clock this afternoon? Any of the following could be appropriate replies. Taking a siesta, relaxing in an armchair, sunbathing, sitting for a portrait, waiting for the Carfax traffic lights to change, being x-rayed, getting my hair cut, sitting in Whitehall in civil disobedience, hunger striking. Each of these replies would satisfy Bentham's definition of an omission as physical non-movement, keeping at rest, yet we should not call any of them an omission. Bentham's criteria is no doubt a negative necessary condition for an omission, but it is not a sufficient one. I don't think it's even a negative necessary condition, but I won't bore you with this right now. But the point is that look at these examples where you can describe them in ways that are, in a sense, doing nothing or keeping at rest. But nonetheless, compare not eating to being on hunger strike, and look at the phenomenology we associate these things. To think of you might I can be still, not eat, do nothing, and yet in a certain context, that's being on hunger strike, and being on hunger strike may be making a political point against I don't know what, and it may in itself have massive effects or not, and so on and so forth. So this is the idea that the thought that how do I know whether I'm doing something or doing nothing? I think it's just not an easy question. Of course you might say, look, I can describe it as omitting to eat, and I can give it the positive description of being on hunger strike. And that's because this is a kind of, we can think of it as a quite atomistic case. But then you might think, if I'm on hunger strike for several weeks, is every instance of not eating being on hunger strike? How exactly are we individuating these actions? Is it that, every second I'm performing a new act of not eating? That doesn't seem right as well. Okay, Gilbert Ryle. It's a very strange list, which is why I have it here. So this is his list of the class of negative acts. You'll see why it's a strange list. Refraining, some of it is fine, of course. Refraining, abstaining, postponing, shirking, neglecting, disobeying, overlooking, condoning, particularly weird one, forgiving. So that's a negative act for I find that very odd. Acquiescing, ignoring, idling, pausing, resting, hesitating, omitting, enduring, waiting, and so on and so forth. And the last one, again slightly weird, trusting. Okay, so one question is why is forgiving and trusting, why are these negative for Ryle? And it immediately, because of the positive associations we might have with these words, it throws in something I haven't talked about at all, which is that when we have positive and negative so far, these weren't value terms, right? These weren't good and bad actions, right? And of course we may think of these as positive in the evaluative sense, right? Forgiveness is a good thing. So then you might think, oh, there are positive negative acts, right? So there are negative acts that aren't failures, that it's a good thing, but they're still negative. I'm not convinced that the descriptive distinction between positive and negative and the evaluative distinction between positive and negative don't blur in certain points. So I think there are cases where what counts as a positive redescription versus a negative redescription can't be completely separated from the evaluative questions. And I will give examples of this in the last 5 minutes of the talk, so I'll come back to that. But leaving that aside, you might think, okay, but even on descriptive basis, why is forgiving negative? I guess Ryle thinks you don't need to do anything to forgive, and this is very contentious. You may think trusting is just a lack of suspecting or something like that. But it starts getting odd. What makes trusting negative or suspecting positive, and vice versa? I guess if you view trust as just an absence of suspicion, to go back to absences, then you might be onto something. But you might think, well, why isn't suspicion just an absence of trust? And now we start to lose the sense in which what is positive and what is negative, which is an absence of which. And I think there are these cases where it's not clear, neither has more right to say it's the positive one and the other thing is its absence. And I think this happens with actions as well as with feelings, which is why I don't like this doctrine of doing and allowing. Okay, just keeping track of time. Why does Ryle want to deny that there are negative acts? It's because he holds an, I think, bad view, which is that all acts must be located in time and space. And actually that view in itself isn't bad, but it's that all acts must have a very precise location in time and space. So suppose I don't call you. And we can imagine two cases. One where there was never any question of my calling you. Maybe I don't even know who you are, I have your number. That's like the opera case. Or maybe there's the case where I tell Camilla, I'll ring you at 2, and there he is with his phone, and I'm just not ringing because I'm having a siesta, or something like right? And Ryle wants to say, compare that to I call you. So when did I call you? It's very easy to give an answer. We give a time. Where did I call you? Maybe not as easy actually, but leave that to one side. But Ryle thinks, when did I not call you? Is a very strange question. If I've never rang you in my life, is it every second I'm not calling you? That seems a strange question. You might think, well, if I promise to call you at 2, maybe it's at 2 that I don't call you. And it's certainly true that at 2 I fail to call you, right? That's maybe when a failure occurs. But you might think that not calling isn't something that occurs at 2. And this is Ryle's view. So he says, maybe the example is slightly different. A person who, hearing that the friend she had for years never blabbed the secret, now asks, how many blabbings did the friend not commit? So I keep a secret and I never tell anyone. And Ryle wants to say, how many times do I not tell someone? This is a bad question. He might be right about this, but he infers from this that not blabbing isn't an act, therefore there are no negative acts. He says it would be as ludicrous as asking how many inhabitants does the desert island not contain. There is no counting what is not there. We're almost back to Heidegger at this point. Kent Bach, we have not found reason to suppose that refrainings or omittings are actions. Of course, they can occur during the course of performing an action. Okay, so we get a similar, so he wants to say that of course in doing something I might omit to do something else, but that doesn't give us enough to think it's an action. We're now on side 2 of your handout, and this is the opposite view to Ryle. This is Bruce Bermazen, who was is a Davidsonian. The omission took place when he was asleep. So he's thinking of the case where I failed to call you because I'm sleeping at 2 p.m. I'm having my siesta, and he wants to say that's when the omission took place. And because of that, he wants to say, look, negative acts can be located precisely in time, in space and time, and therefore they exist. I think there are independent reasons for not thinking that all actions must have very precise spatio-temporal locations. This is kind of a topic for another day, but very quickly, think of the old examples where someone puts poison in their cup and they die 8 years later as a result of the poisoning, or whatever the time stretch you want to have is, even a month later or whatever. When did the killing occur, and so on and so forth. Of course, it would be weird if there was no time or space in which it occurred. But I don't see why this has to be particularly precise. So you might think, and certainly for legal reasons, this will be the case, that in some cases the killing just occurred in the 1980s, for example. So we'll have a location, but it might not be at time T1. And again, think of cases where I poisoned someone in one country and they died in another country, and so on. We might only be able to give very general locations for these things. And so, if I promise to call you at 2, I find it really odd to think that there's an action of not calling you which occurs at precisely 2, because had I called you at 10 seconds past 2, there wouldn't have been a failure to call you at 2, right? Okay. Donald Davidson is really the person who thinks actions are kind of neutral and we have positive and negative descriptions of them. One of the things I have done is fail to discuss the problem of negative actions. And a different example he gives, not eating a persimmon is something I did, presumably when offered it, or something like that. I find that a bit strange. What did you do? The thing I did was not eat a persimmon. You might think, no, that's just not doing something. But my not eating a little fruit when offered it might be offending you. So maybe what I did isn't not eating a persimmon. Maybe what I did was offend you, or, transgress some cultural taboo or whatever. This is what I did. And now we have a positive description, though negative in evaluative terms. Okay, I'm going to skip the next one for reasons of time, and I'm just going to, before I get on to the next section, I have a few contrasts here to kind of summarize some things. So you might think, here are some contrasts: not doing something, not eating a fruit, versus doing not eating a fruit. You might think, what's that? That would be a bit like me doing nothing by doing performance art, or something like that. But you might think, look, if a negative act is meant to be something I do, then it starts getting weird. If you think there's such a thing as not eating a fruit, and the thing I'm doing is that thing, not eating a fruit. And Davidson sometimes talks in these ways, and to me that's wrong. But that doesn't mean that the only alternative is that there are no negative acts. You might think, look, not eating a fruit is only a negative description because one and the same act could be offending you, or something like that. So there needn't be a not-fying that I'm doing for there to be such things as negative acts, I think. Not doing something versus not doing something. I don't know if this translates, but so there's a distinction there. And where we move the italics might make it might make a difference too. And think of, this is the last one here, intending not to do something versus intending to not do something. So you might think, if I intend not to eat again because I'm going to go on hunger strike or something like that, versus I'm intending to not eat again. So this is a curious distinction, because depending on what we put in as phi, it will either make no difference, so the language really won't matter at all, or one of them will look like something that I can't intend. What is it to intend to not go to the opera or something like that? So the question of whether a negative act is doing not by or not doing fine. This is what these really kind of amount to. And so you might think, look, then of course there's no such thing one does that is not fine, kind of from an ontological point of view. And all there is not doing fine. And that motivates the view that, okay, so these are all failures, and we're now using failure not in an evaluative sense, but in the A case of not doing is a failure. But then you end up thinking, that can't be right, because look at all the different things we're not doing right now, and we don't think of these as acts. Okay, and this brings us to the description stuff. This is 3 on your handout, but I've talked about this a bit, so I'll go through this quickly and move on to other things I want to talk about. But here's a question. Is every case of not doing phi a case of doing something else? So this was Davidson's view. So he's the person I'm closest to on this, but I worry about this thought that we individuate acts in such a fine way that every case of not doing something is a case of doing something else. Here's the opposition. This is Alvin Goldman. we must commit ourselves to at least some negative act tokens. Things like S is not turning his head at a certain time, or S is not raising his hand at a certain time, have as much claim to be considered basic act tokens as their positive counterparts. Compared to Davidson and Vermazen, even, and there's a difference between Davidson and Vermazen as well. Do Davidson first. Even when a negative act exists, being negative is not a characteristic of the act, but the characterization of the act. So this is just the old view that we have the act, and there's a positive and negative characterization. And all it means to say that there are negative acts is to say that there are these characterizations. Whereas Vermazen gives it a slightly different twist. Negative events do not, strictly speaking, exist. And he's not denying anything that Davidson has said. All he's saying is that the rhetoric is very, very different, is that he thinks of acts as events. It's not the event that's negative, it's the description of the event that's negative, right? Okay, so what should we conclude from all this? There's some interesting literature in ethnomethodology which looks at what they're calling doables, but it's not quite how the term might be used in analytic philosophy. A doable is a kind of accepted cultural type. So, for example, zoning out in front of the TV is a doable in certain societies. If you don't have a concept of television, you can't zone out in front of the TV. It's not a doable. It's not something you might consider doing after work. So there are these kind of, giving a PowerPoint presentation is a doable. For me, a remote doable, but it's a doable. So there are things that we get the concepts of socio-culturally, and then we can do them or not do them, and they affect our choices. The mere fact that this is something one could do. And of course, some doables are more remote to certain people than others. So you might have the concept of zoning out to the TV, but if you're not remotely interested in TV, like me, it's not, in a sense, it's not a doable for you, but you understand it as a doable for other people, right? So Sachs, for example, has an interesting case where one of the things that are doables are being an ordinary person, right? To spend your time in ordinary ways, having usual thoughts, and so on. So this is now you're kind of thinking of action as a kind of acting in a way, but it's the thought that you might, kind of quite consciously just say, oh, I'm sick of this philosophy, I just want to do something ordinary today, or something. And you go about being an ordinary person, or trying to be an ordinary person, or something like that. He talks of, this is actually Velleman talking about Garfinkel and Sachs. Being bored is something we can do. And most importantly, doing nothing is something we can do. A bit like being ordinary. We can do being ordinary, we can do doing nothing. And that isn't necessarily what I began with, this kind of performance art of doing nothing. But you might think, I'm going to do nothing tonight. And that's a kind of doing nothing. And it can involve doing all sorts of little things, of course. Putting your feet up or whatever. And these are kind of cases of doing nothing. But that aside, think of now not helping someone, or maybe not giving money to someone asking for money on the street or something like that. So whether that counts as not doing something or doing, not doing something will really depend on how you're conceiving of the situation. You may make a point of not giving money to someone. This is very different from being in a rush to catch your train and not giving money to someone, for example. So there are going to be all these kind of contextual frameworks which will affect whether something counts as doing not phi rather than not doing phi, and so on and so forth. And this brings us to my favorite example, and then I'll end on a slightly different note. My favorite example comes from a book from Ian McEwan called The Children Act. And in fact, the example isn't really the quotation I'm going to, or the two quotations I'm going to read out. The example is really the book, the whole book, which you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to read out. And part of what's interesting about it is that I'm not sure what I'll tell you about the book is intentional or not. It's just not clear. So no reviews of the book really talk about this, and I haven't heard Ian McEwan talk about it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't intentional, of course. And I don't want to sort of say too much about the story and give spoilers and so on. But the book is completely replete with negative and positive descriptions contrasted all the time. So you have, whatever character you're talking about, you have paragraph after paragraph of both their specific acts and lifelong activities being described in negative terms, from things like being, I don't know, an absent father, not attending school, all sorts of things like that. And then positive terms, often for the same acts or for related acts. And then the evaluative and the positive and negative are often switched as well as we're going along. So we get a kind of double switching. And I can only give you a tiny taste. So this is a couple. The man has cheated on her, and she wants to walk away. So the question is, who's breaking the marriage, or something like that? And think of giving up. If I said, is giving up positive or a negative act? This is where I start to think the evaluative and the descriptive start getting very messy. I don't think, and there's an interesting use of we, of course, as well. I don't think we should give up. Do you? And you're the one who's walking away. I think you have a part in this too. I'm not the one about to wreck our marriage, so you say. And so the person who's had an affair is like, I'm not the one about to wreck our marriage. You're the one walking away. And then think of, you can describe walking away as giving up on the marriage, and then ask, is this a positive or a negative description? You could instead have the description tolerating an affair. Is that a positive or a negative description? What is action and what is inaction at this point? There's a more standard example, separating the twins. These are conjoined twins where if you don't kill one of them, both will die. If you actively kill one of them, one will be saved. Separating the twins would be to kill Matthew. Not separating them would be, by omission, to kill both. And then you start getting these weird, and here I've only got obliterate the potential of meaningful life. But you get these other descriptions in the rest of the chapter. This comes from where not doing something, or even doing nothing, is obeying God's will in the mind of the person doing nothing, for example. And doing something is disobeying God's will, or something like that, and vice versa. So they keep getting switched. And so if we start with the kind of clear distinctions we began with, and then started asking, so is this giving up an action or an omission? doing nothing because that's obeying God's will, an act or an omission, I think the question just, we lose our grasp on what an action and an omission is. And it's not that I think McEwen has, the perfect answer to what is an act or an omission. It's that he brings forth all the difficulties. And so I want to end. So this is actually Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. And translations of this passage vary a lot, so I'm not doing theology. Even the wise are bewildered in this matter of what is action and what is inaction. One who sees inaction in action and action in inaction is intelligent among mankind. And even though engaged in action, he is in the transcendental position. The last bit is particularly hard to translate, I'm told. And the point isn't that, look how wise Ian McEwen is, or something like that, because he sees action in inaction. It's that I'm not even sure he's always doing it on purpose. So part of the thing is that you can always see more action in inaction, and you can always find more inaction in action. And it's very hard to conclusively make a list of all the actions that take place when someone, all the positive doings that happen when someone doesn't do something, and all the negative non-doings that happen when someone does something. And of course, in the Gita, non-action is seen as a kind of ideal. So, when you have people who say, maybe the best thing is to do nothing, or something like that, right? The ideal is to reach doing nothing. And the wise person fails, they're still engaged in action. But I think, from my point of view, one is always in danger of being engaged in action or not being engaged in action because they can't be separated in this way. But I do find it interesting that from this perspective, the failure is to be engaged in action, right? So we began with Bentham thinking of inaction as a failure, and we end with the Gita where action is the failure, right? It's a failure to do nothing, which is the goal. And I'll stop here. Thanks.